In 1893, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner stood before the American Historical Association in Chicago and delivered a paper that changed how Americans understood themselves. His argument was simple and devastating. The American frontier had closed. The vast open territories of the West, the land that had defined the national character for 3 centuries, that had absorbed the restless, the ambitious, the desperate, and the violent, was now settled. The wilderness was gone. And with it, Turner argued, something essential about America had ended. He was right about the ending. He was more complicated about everything else. Because the Wild West, the 30-odd years between roughly the end of the Civil War and the dawn of the 20th century, was not the heroic, simple, romantic story that dime novels, early cinema, and decades of mythology constructed around it. It was bloodier, more politically complex, more racially violent, and more economically driven than the mythology admits, and it produced some of the most extraordinary and terrible episodes in American history. The land and the people. The American West in the decades following the Civil War was not empty. This is the first and most important fact to establish. Before the westward expansion reached its fullest intensity, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain Territories, and the desert Southwest were home to millions of Native Americans, the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Apache, the Nez Perce, and dozens of other nations who had built complex civilizations across the continent for thousands of years. The Plains tribes, in particular, had developed horse cultures of extraordinary sophistication after Spanish horses reached North America in the 16th century. The Comanche Empire, at its height in the early 19th century, dominated more than 240,000 square miles of territory and was militarily formidable enough to halt Spanish, Mexican, and early American expansion for decades. What the 1840s brought was manifest destiny, the explicit ideological assertion that the United States was destined by God and by nature to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that this expansion was not conquest but fulfillment, and that the peoples occupying the land between were obstacles to be displaced rather than nations to be negotiated with. This ideology drove the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which transferred California and the Southwest to American control. It drove the forced removal of tribal nations from lands guaranteed by treaty. And it drove the settlement pressure that would eventually bring hundreds of thousands of migrants west in search of land, gold, and a new beginning. Gold and the rush that changed everything. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall found flakes of gold in the American River at Sutter's Mill in California. Within a year, the California gold rush had drawn approximately 300,000 people to the territory from across the United States and from as far away as China, Australia, and Chile. The scale of the migration was staggering. California's non-native population went from roughly 800 people in 1848 to over 100,000 by the end of 1849. San Francisco, a settlement of perhaps 1,000 people before the discovery, became a city of 25,000 within 2 years. The supply towns, mining camps, and transit routes that developed to support the 49ers, as the gold rush migrants were called, created the infrastructure of a transformed West. Most of the miners who came did not get rich. The placer deposits that could be worked by individuals with a pan and a shovel were exhausted quickly, and the harder to extract gold deposits required capital, machinery, and corporate organization that individual miners could not provide. What the gold rush left behind was a population, a transportation network, and an economic system that accelerated every subsequent development in the West. A second major gold rush hit the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1874, following an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer that confirmed gold deposits in territory guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. The United States government's response to the resulting pressure from prospectors was to abandon the treaty, attempt to purchase the Black Hills, and when the Lakota refused, to declare open military season on the territory. This led directly to the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Little Bighorn and the Plains Wars. June 25, 1876. The banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Custer led approximately 600 men of the 7th Cavalry against a Lakota and Northern Cheyenne encampment he believed held perhaps 800 warriors. The actual encampment held somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors. Custer divided his forces and attacked. Within hours, Custer and approximately 268 soldiers were dead, the worst defeat suffered by the U.S. Army in the entire era of the Indian Wars. Sitting Bull, who had led the spiritual preparation for the battle, and Crazy Horse, who commanded much of the fighting, became the most famous Native American leaders in history. The battle was a tactical catastrophe for the Army and a strategic disaster for the Lakota. The national outrage that followed the news of Custer's defeat led to a massive military escalation. By 1877, Crazy Horse had surrendered at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. In September of that year, he was killed by a bayonet. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances, while held in military custody. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, returned in 1881, was eventually killed by agency police in 1890 during the events surrounding the Ghost Dance movement. Plains Wars effectively ended with the massacre at Wounded Knee on December 29, 1890, where U.S. Army soldiers opened fire on a Lakota encampment in South Dakota, killing somewhere between 150 and 300 men, women, and children. The Army awarded 20 medals of honor to soldiers who participated. It was the last major armed conflict of the Indian Wars. The cattle drives and the cowboy. The mythology of the Wild West centers almost entirely on the cowboy, and the cowboy was real, just considerably more complicated than the mythology acknowledges. The cattle industry of the post-Civil War era was built on the Texas Longhorn, a breed descended from Spanish cattle that had multiplied across the Texas landscape during the war years when labor was unavailable to manage them. By 1865, an estimated 5 million longhorns roamed the Texas ranges. In the north and east, beef prices were high and cattle were scarce. In Texas, they were nearly worthless because there was no market. The cattle drives solved this problem. Cowboys, who were roughly a third Mexican or Mexican-American, a significant percentage black, and the rest white, with a demographic diversity that the mythology almost entirely erased, drove herds of thousands of cattle north across the open range to railroad towns where they could be loaded onto trains to eastern markets. Abilene, Kansas became the first of these cattle towns, reached by the Chisholm Trail. Dodge City followed, then Wichita, then Cheyenne. The drives were brutal, unglamorous work. A cowboy on a cattle drive earned approximately $1 a day, worked from before sunrise until after dark, slept on the ground for months, and faced the constant risks of stampedes, river crossings, and weather. The romantic image of the cowboy gazing contemplatively at a sunset is not incompatible with the reality. The landscape was genuinely extraordinary, but it omits the exhaustion, the mundanity, and the economic precariousness that defined most cowboys' lives. The outlaws and the lawmen. The towns at the end of the cattle trails became flashpoints for everything the mythology eventually celebrated: gunfights, gambling halls, brothels, and the constant tension between law enforcement and men who had spent months in the saddle with significant amounts of cash and a well-developed appetite for both. Wyatt Earp spent time as a lawman in Wichita and as assistant city marshal in Dodge City before moving to Tombstone, Arizona, where his life produced the single most famous gunfight in American history. On October 26, 1881, at a vacant lot near the OK Corral, Earp and his brothers Virgil and Morgan, alongside the consumptive dentist and gambler Doc Holliday, confronted a group of cowboys affiliated with a loosely organized criminal network. The gunfight lasted approximately 30 seconds. 3 men died. It became, over the following century, the defining image of frontier justice. Jesse James built a different kind of legend. A former Confederate guerrilla who refused to accept the end of the war, James led a gang that robbed banks and trains across Missouri and the surrounding states for 15 years. He was not, in the mythology of the poor rural South, a criminal. He was a Confederate holdout, a Robin Hood figure, a symbol of resistance to the Yankee capitalism that the railroads and banks represented. On April 3, 1882, he was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang, while straightening a picture in his St. Joseph, Missouri home. Ford had been offered a pardon and reward money by the governor of Missouri. James became more famous in death than he had been in life. Billy the Kid, born William Henry McCarty, also known as William Bonney, was 21 years old when he was shot and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in Fort Sumner, New Mexico on July 14, 1881. He had been involved in the Lincoln County War, a range conflict between rival business factions that had produced multiple killings and was attributed with 21 kills, a figure that historians have substantially disputed. He was a young man who moved in violent environments and died in one. The legend that followed bears only passing resemblance to the documented record. The Railroad and the End. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, fundamentally changed the conditions that made the Wild West possible. Before the railroad, the vast distances of the West were a barrier that limited both settlement and law enforcement. Communities could exist for years in states of practical lawlessness simply because the nearest federal court was weeks of travel away. The railroad collapsed those distances. It brought settlers who could sustain families and communities. It brought goods that made self-sufficient frontier survival less necessary. It brought newspapers, politicians, lawyers, and eventually the mechanisms of institutional order. It also completed the destruction of the buffalo herds that had sustained the Plains tribes for centuries. Professional hunters, enabled by railroad access and the eastern market for hides, killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison between 1870 and 1890. The slaughter was explicitly supported by the U.S. military as a strategy of economic warfare against the Plains tribes, whose existence depended on the buffalo for food, shelter, clothing, and trade. By 1890, the bison were nearly extinct. The Plains tribes were confined to reservations. The cattle drives had ended. Barbed wire had divided the open range. The railroad made the drives unnecessary, and overgrazing had degraded the grasslands that had supported the herds. The Homestead Act of 1862 had brought hundreds of thousands of farming families to land that the Plains tribes had occupied, and the legal framework of American property rights had simply overwritten every prior claim. The frontier that Turner declared closed had been consumed by the forces that the mythology would spend the next century romanticizing. The Wild West lasted roughly 30 years. It left behind a body count, a landscape transformed, a population of nations destroyed, and a mythology that grew larger than the reality almost from the moment the reality ended. It was not won by heroism, though there was heroism in it. It was not settled by rugged individualism alone, though there were genuinely extraordinary individuals in it. It was primarily a story about what happens when a government with an ideological mandate and a technological advantage encounters peoples without equivalent military or economic resources, and about the human beings on every side of that collision who tried to make something of the world they found themselves in. The story it tells about itself is not the story that happened. Both versions are worth knowing. Subscribe for more history that goes deeper than the headline.